For decades, Richard and Pat Nixon were held up as the picture of a stable, traditional American marriage, two proper, disciplined people who stood together through the highest office in the country and the lowest disgrace any president had ever faced. But inside the White House, the two of them slept in separate bedrooms, communicated through aides rather than each other, and, according to people who worked closely with them, endured stretches of their marriage that biographers would later describe as almost entirely loveless. This is the real story of Richard and Pat Nixon. A courtship built on persistence nobody would recommend today. Richard Nixon met Thelma Catherine Ryan, known to everyone as Pat, in January of 1937, when the two of them tried out for parts in the same community theater production in Whittier, California, titled Dark Shadows. Richard, a young lawyer just beginning his career, was reportedly smitten with Pat from the very first night they met, and he set about pursuing her with the same relentless, single-minded determination that would later become one of the defining traits of his entire political career. Both Richard and Pat had grown up in Southern California under circumstances that, while different in their particulars, shared a common thread of hard work and modest means. Richard's own upbringing in Yorba Linda and later Whittier, California, had been shaped by his father, Francis's struggling small business ventures, and his mother, Hannah's deeply devout Quaker faith, an upbringing that instilled in Richard both a fierce work ethic and a certain emotional reserve that would follow him for the rest of his life. That shared background of modest, hard-working origins may well have been part of what initially drew the two of them together, each recognizing in the other a similar kind of determined self-sufficiency forged through early hardship. Richard would later speak with particular reverence about his mother's influence throughout his own political career, referencing her steady, quiet strength in some of the most significant speeches of his life, including his own farewell address to White House staff, a reflection of just how deeply his own upbringing had shaped his understanding of duty, sacrifice, and emotional restraint. Pat, however, was considerably more reluctant. She had grown up determined to remain independent and had little interest in rushing into any serious romantic commitment, and by her own later account to a biographer, she initially found Richard's intensity somewhat alarming, describing her early impression of him in terms suggesting she genuinely wondered whether something was wrong with him. Judged by modern standards, several of Richard's early courting behaviors, including reportedly offering to drive Pat to her dates with other men simply so he could spend more time near her, would likely be viewed today as a serious red flag rather than romantic devotion. Despite that unconventional and, by today's standards, uncomfortable approach to courtship, Richard's persistence eventually won Pat over. The two dated for roughly 2 years before marrying on June 21, 1940, in a modest ceremony at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California. Letters the two exchanged during their courtship and later during Richard's wartime service reveal a young man genuinely devoted to Pat, writing to her that even when he did not say very much in her presence, every part of him loved her constantly. Biographer Will Swift, who was granted access to a number of these letters that had never previously been reviewed by other researchers, described them as genuinely transformative to his own understanding of the marriage, revealing a far more openly affectionate and emotionally present version of Richard Nixon than the reserved, calculating public figure most Americans came to know decades later. That gap between the tender, unguarded young man revealed in those private wartime letters and the far more controlled, formal public figure Richard would eventually become speaks to just how much the demands of his political ambitions would go on to reshape, or at least conceal, the more vulnerable sides of his personality over the following decades. Swift, in interviews promoting his own research, described his own initial skepticism about the marriage gradually giving way to a considerably more sympathetic understanding once he had the opportunity to review these previously unseen letters firsthand. a shift in perspective that shaped much of the more nuanced portrait he ultimately presented in his own published work. That kind of quiet, understated devotion, expressed far more openly in private letters than in any public display of affection, would go on to become one of the defining and most misunderstood characteristics of the entire Nixon marriage. What the public would eventually see of Richard and Pat Nixon, particularly once Richard's political career began accelerating, looked almost nothing like the warmth expressed in those early wartime letters, and the gap between the private and public versions of their relationship would only widen as the stakes of Richard's ambitions grew larger. A childhood that prepared Pat for almost anything. Long before she ever met Richard Nixon, Pat's own early life had already given her a level of resilience and self-sufficiency that few people around her fully understood or appreciated. Born Thelma Catherine Ryan on March 16, 1912, in the small mining town of Ely, Nevada, she was nicknamed Pat by her Irish father, William Ryan, in honor of her birth falling just before St. Patrick's Day. The family soon relocated to a small truck farm in Artesia, California, where Pat grew up working alongside her father and two older brothers in a household that offered few luxuries, even in the best of times. William Ryan himself had lived a varied and difficult life before Pat's birth, working at various points as a sailor, a gold miner, and eventually a truck farmer, moving his family from place to place in search of steadier work. Pat's mother, Catherine, born in Germany, had already been widowed once before marrying William, bringing two children from her first marriage into the newly blended Ryan household, meaning Pat grew up not only with her two older biological brothers, but also a half-sister and half-brother from her mother's earlier marriage, a genuinely full and demanding household for a family already stretched thin financially. Though raised Methodist, William was said to have returned to the Catholic faith of his own baptism shortly before his death, a small but telling detail that speaks to the complicated, deeply personal spiritual journey he underwent during his final difficult years, years that Pat herself witnessed up close while caring for him through his prolonged illness. Tragedy struck early and repeatedly throughout Pat's childhood. Her mother, Catherine, died of cancer in either 1925 or 1926, depending on the source, when Pat was still only a young teenager, leaving her to take over the full range of household responsibilities for her father and brothers almost overnight. Just a few years later, her father developed a serious lung illness, ultimately identified as silicosis, a condition connected directly to his earlier years spent working in mines, and Pat nursed him through a prolonged decline until his death in 1930, when Pat was only 18 years old, leaving her essentially orphaned and entirely on her own. Decades later, reflecting on those difficult years in an interview with journalist and feminist Gloria Steinem during Richard's 1968 presidential campaign, Pat spoke with striking candor about just how little space her circumstances had ever left for the kind of self-reflection or personal dreaming most young people take for granted. She explained that she had never really had the luxury of considering who she wanted to become or which people she most admired, because survival itself had consumed nearly all of her available time and energy throughout those formative years. Rather than allowing that hardship to derail her ambitions, Pat worked her way through junior college and eventually the University of Southern California, taking on a wide range of jobs along the way, including work as a bank teller, a department store clerk, and even occasional film extra work to fund her own education. She graduated cum laude in 1937, the same year she met Richard, having built, entirely through her own effort, exactly the kind of self-reliant, disciplined character that would go on to define her approach to nearly every subsequent challenge in her life, including the extraordinarily difficult decades still ahead of her as Richard's wife. That early experience of loss and self-sufficiency shaped Pat into a woman who rarely complained publicly and who approached even the most painful circumstances of her adult life with the same quiet, determined resilience she had first developed as a teenager, caring for a dying father. It was a temperament that would serve her, in some ways, remarkably well throughout the decades of political turbulence still to come, even as it also meant she rarely, if ever, allowed the public any real glimpse into how much those years actually cost her personally. The rise that slowly pushed Pat to the margins. Richard Nixon's political career accelerated rapidly following the end of the Second World War, and Pat, despite her own considerable intelligence and capability, found herself increasingly cast into a supporting role focused almost entirely on advancing her husband's ambitions rather than pursuing any independent path of her own. She campaigned tirelessly alongside him throughout his early congressional and senatorial races, and by 1953, when Richard became vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, Pat had already spent years perfecting the disciplined, camera-ready public persona that would follow her for the remainder of her public life. That role required a considerable personal sacrifice on Pat's part, given how thoroughly she had built her own independent identity in the years before meeting Richard, working her way through college entirely on her own initiative and graduating with academic distinction. Once she became attached to Richard's political ambitions, however, that independent identity gradually receded further and further into the background, replaced by an increasingly narrow public role focused on projecting warmth, stability, and unwavering support for her husband's career, regardless of whatever personal cost that role might be extracting from her privately. Pat herself rarely spoke publicly about any resentment she may have privately felt over this gradual erosion of her own independent path, maintaining instead the same disciplined, uncomplaining composure that had defined her character since her earliest years caring for her dying parents, a consistency of temperament that made it genuinely difficult for outside observers, then or now, to fully separate her authentic feelings from the carefully managed public role she had spent decades perfecting. That persona, however, came at a considerable personal cost. As the demands of Richard's political career intensified, biographers who later studied the marriage in detail identified a pattern in which Pat's own influence and involvement in her husband's inner circle steadily diminished, particularly once Richard ascended to the presidency in 1969. Author Annette Dunlap, among others who researched the marriage extensively, described a genuine rift that developed during these White House years, one that coincided with Pat's position within her husband's daily political operation becoming increasingly marginalized. The structural divide within the Nixon White House itself reflected this marginalization quite literally, with Richard's own political operation, commonly referred to as the West Wing, functioning almost entirely separately from Pat's own staff and responsibilities, based in what was known as the East Wing. Presidential historians who have studied this particular administrative arrangement have noted that while some degree of separation between a president's political staff and a first lady's ceremonial staff was fairly typical, the degree of genuine distance and lack of coordination between Richard's and Pat's respective operations during the Nixon years stood out as unusually pronounced, even by the standards of previous administrations. That structural separation, physical as much as it was organizational, offers its own quiet but telling illustration of just how compartmentalized the Nixon marriage had become by the height of Richard's presidency. Two spouses running what amounted to entirely separate operations under the very same roof, connected far more by shared history and formal obligation than by any consistent, day-to-day collaboration or communication. That marginalization played out in remarkably concrete, almost mundane ways. Richard reportedly relied on his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, to relay messages to his own wife rather than communicating with her directly, an arrangement that only deepened the emotional distance already growing between them. Haldeman, who by his own admission relished his reputation as a tough, uncompromising presence within the Nixon White House, documented in his own private diary that dealing with what he privately referred to as the Pat Nixon situation had become a genuine, ongoing problem, and he reportedly referred to the First Lady dismissively behind her back, using her actual birth name, Thelma, rather than the name she had gone by for decades. That particular detail, a senior White House aide privately mocking the First Lady's own chosen name behind her back, while simultaneously serving as her husband's primary means of communicating with her, captures something genuinely troubling about the internal dynamics of the Nixon White House during these years. A level of institutional disrespect toward Pat that went well beyond simple political disorganization, and that spoke directly to how little genuine regard some of Richard's closest advisers held for his own wife. Haldeman's diaries, published years after his death, offered historians a genuinely unfiltered look into the internal culture of the Nixon White House, one where even the president's own spouse could apparently become a subject of private derision among his most trusted staff. A dynamic that likely would have remained entirely hidden from public view had those diaries never eventually come to light. That dynamic, a president relying on a staff intermediary rather than speaking directly with his own wife about matters affecting her, offers one of the most telling and unsettling details connected to the entire Nixon marriage, a level of emotional and practical distance that stood in sharp contrast to the carefully managed public image of a united, traditional American family the Nixons continued presenting to the country throughout these same years. Separate bedrooms behind closed doors. As Richard and Pat settled into life inside the White House, one particular detail about their living arrangements would eventually become public knowledge and would go on to fuel years of speculation about the genuine state of their marriage. The two of them maintained separate bedrooms. In a 1972 interview with Time magazine, Richard gave a tour of his own private bedroom, a room outfitted with a single bed that offered no visible indication that it was ever shared by two people. Richard explained the arrangement in practical terms, describing his own erratic sleep patterns, waking frequently between midnight and 2 in the morning when his mind felt clearest, turning on the light, and either dictating notes into a tape recorder or writing them down by hand. According to accounts later documented in biographer Will Swift's detailed study of the marriage, Pat herself corroborated this explanation, reportedly telling a White House staffer that nobody could realistically share a bed with Richard, given how frequently he woke during the night to work. That explanation, while plausible on its own terms, did little to quiet broader public and media speculation about what the separate sleeping arrangements might actually reveal about the deeper emotional state of the marriage. Both Richard and Pat maintained a notably formal, restrained public demeanor throughout their years in the national spotlight, rarely displaying physical affection in front of cameras, even during moments that might have called for it. A reticence that led many observers and journalists of the era to characterize their relationship as cold, distant, and fundamentally passionless, an image that would follow the Nixons for the remainder of both of their lives. That reputation for coldness took on an additional dimension once the broader women's liberation movement began sweeping across American culture in the late 1960s and early 1970s. A period during which Pat's own carefully cultivated, traditionally deferential public image increasingly struck feminist commentators as genuinely anachronistic. Critics began referring to her dismissively as Plastic Pat, a nickname that captured just how artificial and emotionally hollow much of the public perceived her carefully managed persona to be, regardless of whatever genuine feeling actually existed underneath it. Pat herself, notably, held more progressive personal views than that public caricature suggested, becoming the first sitting First Lady to publicly support the Equal Rights Amendment. a detail that complicated the simplistic image of her as merely a passive, submissive political spouse. She reportedly grew visibly frustrated at times with the dismissive, one-dimensional way the press characterized her, telling associates that she felt women already possessed equal rights if only they were willing to exercise them. A somewhat pointed rebuttal to critics who assumed her own quiet public demeanor reflected a lack of genuine conviction on the subject. Some biographers who studied the marriage more recently have pushed back against that characterization, arguing that the culture of the era simply did not encourage public displays of affection among prominent political couples, pointing out that even President Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy, often remembered as a far more romantic pairing, were themselves rarely openly affectionate in front of cameras during their own years in the White House. Whatever the full truth behind the Nixons' public restraint, though, the separate bedrooms and the reliance on staff intermediaries for basic communication between husband and wife painted a picture that went well beyond simple old-fashioned reserve, suggesting instead a marriage that had, by the height of Richard's presidency, developed genuine and significant distance between its two central figures. The book that confirmed America's worst suspicions. In 1976, journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the same reporting duo whose investigative work had helped bring down Richard's presidency 2 years earlier, published a book titled The Final Days, chronicling the collapse of the Nixon administration in exhaustive detail. Among the book's most explosive revelations were accounts from people close to the Nixon family, describing a marriage that had, for many years by that point, become essentially sexless and, to a considerable degree, loveless, a characterization that stood in stark and painful contrast to the disciplined, dignified public image both Richard and Pat had worked so hard to maintain throughout their decades in public life. That particular claim, appearing in a book that had already established enormous credibility through its author's earlier Watergate reporting, carried an entirely different weight than ordinary tabloid speculation about a celebrity marriage. Woodward and Bernstein's sourcing throughout the final days drew on extensive interviews with White House staff, advisors, and others who had direct, first-hand access to the Nixons' daily lives, lending their characterization of the marriage a level of documented credibility that made it exceptionally difficult for either Richard or Pat to simply dismiss or deny. The book's broader portrait of the administration's collapse, encompassing everything from Richard's own deteriorating emotional state during his final days in office to the tense, often strained interactions among his senior staff, made its specific claims about the state of the Nixon marriage feel less like isolated gossip and more like one more data point within an already devastating and thoroughly documented account of an administration and a family coming apart under the weight of scandal. The impact of that particular revelation on Pat personally appears to have been genuinely profound. According to widely reported accounts, Pat suffered a major stroke in 1976, and it was said at the time that the stroke occurred while she was in the process of reading The Final Days herself, absorbing in real time the same devastating characterization of her marriage that the rest of the country was now reading as well. Whether or not the timing of the stroke was directly and medically connected to the stress of reading those specific passages, the coincidence itself became one of the most widely repeated and genuinely haunting details connected to the entire saga of the Nixon marriage's collapse from public grace. For a woman who had spent decades maintaining an almost impenetrable public composure, regardless of the political turmoil swirling around her husband, having the most intimate details of her own marriage picked apart and characterized so bluntly in a best-selling book, represented a particular kind of violation, one that arrived at an already devastating moment in both of their lives, only 2 years removed from Richard's resignation and the accompanying disgrace that had upended everything the two of them had spent their entire adult lives building together. That revelation, arriving as it did during one of the most vulnerable periods of the Nixons' entire life together, would go on to permanently shape how historians and the general public alike understood the true nature of their marriage, an understanding considerably darker and more complicated than the image of steady, traditional partnership the Nixons had spent decades carefully cultivating in front of the cameras. In the years that followed, both Richard and Pat reportedly worked together through carefully arranged television documentaries and print interviews to try to push back against and correct what they felt was an unfair and inaccurate portrayal of their relationship, though those efforts never fully succeeded in dislodging the impression the final days had already planted so firmly in the public consciousness. A marriage that handled conflict by avoiding it entirely. According to biographer Will Swift, whose extensive research into the Nixon marriage drew on private letters, interviews, and archival material unavailable to earlier researchers, Richard and Pat developed a highly particular and, in Swift's assessment, ultimately unhealthy pattern for managing conflict throughout their decades together. Rather than confronting disagreements directly, the two of them would frequently handle tension simply by avoiding each other for a period of time, or by communicating indirectly through third parties, rather than addressing whatever the underlying issue actually was. Swift, who spent years researching the marriage for his book, noted that this pattern likely traced back to the emotionally restrained environments both Richard and Pat had grown up within. Households where direct, open expression of difficult feelings was neither modeled nor encouraged. Richard's own strict Quaker upbringing under his devout mother Hannah had instilled in him a deep discomfort with open emotional confrontation, while Pat's own early years, spent absorbing hardship silently while caring for a dying father, had likewise trained her to manage pain privately rather than airing it openly, even with the people closest to her. That pattern of avoidance, according to Swift's research, meant that genuine ruptures within the marriage rarely received the kind of direct, honest confrontation that might have allowed either Richard or Pat to fully process and resolve whatever tension had developed between them. Instead, wounds were more often simply left to fade with time, submerged beneath the demands of Richard's relentless political schedule, only to resurface again during the next inevitable period of stress or crisis. Swift's research also documented, however, that despite this pattern of avoidance, the two of them consistently found ways to reconnect before any single rupture led to what he characterized as a permanent estrangement between them. The final year of the Watergate scandal, arguably the single most stressful and publicly humiliating period of their entire lives together, understandably placed enormous strain on their bond. But according to Swift, the two of them worked painstakingly to rebuild their connection to one another once they retreated into exile in California following Richard's resignation, even as they simultaneously navigated a series of serious, life-threatening health crises during those same difficult years. Presidential speechwriter William Safire, who worked closely alongside the Nixon administration during many of its most difficult years, offered his own perspective on what ultimately bound Richard and Pat together, despite the genuine strain in their marriage, observing that Pat shared her husband's deep-seated insecurities and emotional scar tissue, a similarity in temperament and background that Richard himself acknowledged directly in a 1982 interview, noting that he and Pat had come from remarkably similar circumstances growing up. Safire's own long tenure inside the Nixon White House gave him a genuinely unusual vantage point from which to observe the marriage, and his reflections, offered years after Richard had left office, carried the particular authority of someone who had witnessed both the public performance and, at least occasionally, the private reality behind it. That pattern, genuine and repeated periods of real distance, followed by equally genuine efforts at reconciliation, offers a more complicated and, in some ways, more human portrait of the Nixon marriage than either the idealized public image the couple presented for decades, or the starkly bleak characterization offered by the final days. It was, according to those who studied it most closely, neither purely the model partnership Richard's own campaign materials suggested, nor entirely the loveless, hollow arrangement suggested by Woodward and Bernstein's reporting, but something considerably messier and more genuinely complicated, sitting somewhere between those two extremes. Small signs of genuine affection hidden from public view. Despite the very real distance and dysfunction that characterized significant stretches of their marriage, several people who worked closely alongside the Nixons over the years described witnessing small, private moments of genuine tenderness that rarely, if ever, made their way into public view. Pat's own press secretary, Helen McCain Smith, later told a biographer that she had personally observed evidence of a closeness between Richard and Pat that most outside observers never had any opportunity to witness, describing Richard as someone who left affectionate, carefully written notes tucked beside his wife's pillow. Small, private gestures entirely at odds with his cold, calculating public reputation. That detail, a president known publicly for his guarded, often awkward interpersonal manner, nonetheless taking the time to leave handwritten, affectionate notes for his wife to discover privately, offers a genuinely striking counterpoint to the portrait of emotional coldness that so often dominated public discussion of the marriage. It suggests a man who, whatever his considerable limitations in expressing feeling openly in front of others, retained a genuine capacity for quiet, private tenderness toward the one person who had remained by his side through every stage of his extraordinary and ultimately tumultuous career. Smith's account, offered years after leaving her own position within the Nixon White House, carried particular credibility given her own unique proximity to the day-to-day realities of the marriage, a vantage point few outside observers, then or since, have ever been able to genuinely claim for themselves. Alexander Haig, who served as White House Chief of Staff during the final, most turbulent stretch of Richard's presidency, offered his own assessment of the marriage's underlying emotional reality, stating plainly that he believed Richard genuinely worshipped Pat, an impression he said he had formed directly through his own first-hand experience working closely alongside the president. Haig specifically pushed back against characterizations of the marriage as cold or performative, insisting that whatever the two of them shared privately was neither ostentatious nor false, regardless of how distant or formal the relationship may have appeared to those observing only from the outside. Haig's assessment carries particular weight given his own uniquely close vantage point during arguably the most stressful and closely scrutinized period of the entire Nixon presidency, the final collapse of the administration amid the Watergate scandal, a period during which any genuine cracks in the marriage would have been especially difficult for Richard and Pat to successfully conceal even from their own most senior staff members. Those competing accounts, some describing a marriage hollowed out by decades of political pressure and public scrutiny, others describing genuine, if quietly expressed, devotion hidden carefully behind closed doors, capture just how difficult it remains, even decades later, to arrive at any single definitive understanding of what Richard and Pat Nixon's marriage actually was underneath all of the political theatre, the scandal, and the carefully managed public image both of them worked so hard to maintain throughout their entire adult lives together. The final years and a quiet kind of peace. Following Richard's resignation in August of 1974, the couple retreated to their home in San Clemente, California, largely withdrawing from public life as Richard began the long, difficult process of attempting to rehabilitate his public reputation in the years that followed. Pat, according to those who studied this period of her life closely, played comparatively little overt role in that rehabilitation effort, instead becoming increasingly private and, by several accounts, genuinely reclusive as she grappled with both the public humiliation of Watergate and a series of serious health problems that would continue affecting her for the remainder of her life. That withdrawal from public life stood in sharp contrast to the decades Pat had spent as one of the most visible and closely watched women in the entire country, serving as a genuine goodwill ambassador for the United States across more than 30 different nations during her years as First Lady, and earning recognition from Gallup polling as one of the most admired women in America every single year between 1968 and 1971. The abruptness of her retreat from that level of public engagement into near total seclusion following Richard's resignation reflected just how thoroughly the events of Watergate had upended not only Richard's own career and reputation, but Pat's entire sense of purpose and public identity as well. For a woman who had spent so many years constructing an identity centered around graciousness, diplomacy, and steady public service, the sudden collapse of that role, alongside the accompanying public humiliation that came with it, represented a loss that went well beyond simple embarrassment, touching instead on the very core of how Pat had come to understand her own value and contribution over more than 2 decades in the national spotlight. The Nixons eventually relocated first to New York City in 1980, and then again to Saddle River, New Jersey in 1981, settling into a quieter, considerably lower profile existence as they moved closer to their 2 daughters and growing number of grandchildren. Despite the well-documented periods of genuine distance that had marked so much of their decades together, Pat's own apparent contentment during these final years living alongside Richard has led several biographers to conclude that remaining married to him, whatever the marriage's genuine complications, ultimately represented the right choice for her, even if outside observers sometimes wondered whether she might have been better served by walking away entirely at some point along the way. Pat suffered a second stroke in 1983, leaving her in increasingly frail health for the remainder of the decade. A lifelong smoker who had carefully avoided ever being photographed with a cigarette in public throughout her entire career in the spotlight, Pat eventually developed serious lung problems and emphysema in her final years. She died of lung cancer on June 22, 1993, at the age of 81, with Richard by her side. An ending that mirrored the beginning. Richard Nixon survived his wife by just under a year, dying on April 22, 1994, following a severe stroke, also at the age of 81. The fact that both Richard and Pat died within roughly 10 months of each other, both at the exact same age, struck many who had followed their decades-long, complicated partnership as a strangely fitting final chapter to a relationship that had always defied simple, easy characterization, a marriage that had weathered hardship, historic political triumph, unprecedented public disgrace, and years of genuine private distance, only to end with the two of them passing away within the same short window of time, just as they had spent more than 5 decades of their adult lives bound together through nearly everything. In the years immediately following Pat's death, Richard reportedly struggled visibly with the loss, according to those closest to him during his own final months, a grief that friends and family described as genuine and profound, regardless of whatever complicated history had defined the marriage across its 5 decades. He continued working during that final year, publishing writing on foreign policy and continuing his long, difficult effort to rehabilitate his historical reputation. But colleagues who observed him during this period often noted a man who seemed genuinely diminished by the loss of the one person who had remained his constant companion through every single stage of his extraordinary and turbulent public life. Those closest to Richard during those final months described someone who spoke of Pat frequently and with evident tenderness, a private grief that stood in quiet contrast to the guarded, controlled public figure most of the country had come to know across nearly 5 decades in the national spotlight. Looking back across the full arc of Richard and Pat Nixon's 53 years of marriage, from a courtship built on a level of persistence that would raise serious concern by today's standards, through decades of political ambition that steadily pushed Pat toward the margins of her own husband's inner circle, into a pattern of separate bedrooms and staff-mediated communication that shocked much of the country once it became widely known, and finally to competing accounts from those closest to them describing both genuine coldness and genuine, quietly expressed devotion. The reality of the Nixon marriage emerges as something considerably more layered and more difficult to categorize than either the wholesome, traditional partnership their political campaigns spent decades presenting to American voters, or the starkly bleak, loveless arrangement later suggested by investigative journalists picking through the wreckage of Richard's collapsed presidency. It was, in the end, a marriage built by two genuinely resilient, deeply private people. One that carried both real distance and real devotion in equal, complicated measure, right up until the very end of both of their lives. Perhaps more than any other presidential marriage of the 20th century, the true story of Richard and Pat Nixon resists the kind of simple, tidy narrative that history often prefers, offering instead a genuinely human portrait of two people who endured extraordinary highs and devastating lows together, and who somehow, despite everything, never fully let go of one another until death itself finally did what 53 years of political pressure, public scrutiny, and private struggle never quite managed to accomplish. That resistance to easy categorization may be, in the end, the single most honest thing that can be said about the Nixon marriage at all. Neither the polished campaign photographs nor the damning lines from the final days ever fully captured what actually passed between Richard and Pat behind closed doors, and perhaps no outside account ever really could. What remains, instead, is a portrait assembled from fragments, a note beneath a pillow, a diary entry documenting distance, a friend's recollection of quiet worship, each piece true in its own way, none of them the whole story on its own. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.